Hi. Um, frog in my throat then. Um, we're back, and it's a week on, and my decorating still isn't finished. But that's because I've been on, no, what's it called? Not lockdown. I've been in touch with somebody who's had COVID, and I've had to self-isolate. That's the word. But I'm fine. I come out of self-isolation tomorrow, and hopefully we can get this room finished. This little creature here is a sentinel from the Matrix. So there we are. He's coming to get us. The weather outside is it's all right. It's dripping every now and then on the work surface that we've got outside. So if you hear a tapping, that's what it is. We're going through the Old Testament, and we did Ezra last week, and we're doing Nehemiah this week, and then Esther next week. It's a little bit out of order chronologically, but it's in the order of the Bible. But if I was trying to do things chronologically, Ezra and Nehemiah would be at the end of the Old Testament with Malachi. But we're not doing it chronologically. We'll get on with it as it is. So let's get on with it then. Nehemiah, as we said last time, this is exactly the same sort of setup as Ezra. Which leads us to believe that they had the same writer. These two books were originally called Ezra 1 and Ezra 2 and were bound together. We begin with, in the first part of Nehemiah, with the third return. And it starts with Nehemiah. And Nehemiah gets some bad news from Jerusalem. He was, by this time, the cupbearer to the king, Artaxerxes, who you remember was Esther's stepson. Not the greatest of jobs, because you have to taste the wine to make sure it's not poisoned. But it was a very, very responsible job, and it also made him very much a confidant to the king. He was there all the time by the king's side, trying all the wine and all the water and everything that the king was drinking to make sure it wasn't poisoned. So he would have become a real friend and confidant to the king. He was told in this message from Jerusalem that the walls in Jerusalem, which had been rebuilt, but they hadn't been rebuilt very well, and they continually were getting pulled down. The locals were so angry about the Israelites coming back and rebuilding their city that they were causing chaos and pulling the walls down. And the king saw that Nehemiah was disturbed, and he said, "What's wrong?" And it says that at that point Nehemiah said a prayer. Now, that's a quick prayer. What I like to call, and other people have called, an arrow prayer. And it's just a prayer in the middle of a situation. You pray to God and you pray, please help me, please give me the words. Just a very quick, simple prayer. Prayers don't need to be elongated and drawn out. Prayers can be simple as please help me. Oh, excuse me. And he told the king what was happening. So the king said, "You've been a good friend to me. I'm going to give you the authority to go back and rebuild the walls. And to add to that, I'm going to give you letters to the people who have the materials, that they must give you as much material as is needed to complete the wall." So Nehemiah is intending to go back and complete this work that the king has given him authority to do. And he went back and he made a secret inspection by night. So nobody knew what he had done. Nobody knew that he was doing it. And he went right round the perimeter of Jerusalem and he counted the gates and the lengths of the walls and everything. He made a complete blueprint of the walls. And here is a man that counts the cost before he does anything. He doesn't rush in, and he's a man of faith, and he sees exactly what the task is before him, and he sees exactly what the task is before he starts. And he made the inspection to size up the job, and then the rebuild starts. You could be forgiven for completely mistaking the old walls when you're in Jerusalem. And there are a set of old walls in the present city, and you could be mistaken for imagining that they are what Nehemiah built. But he didn't build the walls in the city. They were only built a few hundred years ago by Solomon the Magnificent. The old city was actually outside the present walls, which is a bit of a shock to some people. It's on a tongue-shaped piece of land down the side, and it's south of the temple area, with the Mosque of Omar and the Mosque Al-Aqsa at its topmost point. And they are based on a piece of land which is about 13 acres at the top of the hill. And there's a street that leads right down from the temple, that goes right down the middle of a ridge, which this land is on. And that's the old high street, for the old city of Jerusalem. And to one side of you've got the temple up here, and then you've got this long tongue piece of land, which was the old city of Jerusalem. And on one side you've got the Valley of Kidron, or the Valley of Graves. On the other side there's a lesser valley, and then you've got Gehenna, which starts at the bottom of the tongue of Jerusalem and runs west and then north. These valleys all drain into the Dead Sea. And it was on this ridge between the first two valleys that you that you have the old city of the Jebusites called Salem. Now Salem means city of peace, and Salem, we all tend to know Salem from Salem's Lot. Salem is actually part of Jerusalem. If you split the J from Salem, you get Jerusalem, and that was the seat of a priest king called Melchizedek. And if you remember your Bible, then Jesus says that he's going to be a king in the form of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is somebody who's in the very first book of the Bible. Is it the first book or the second book? I'm not sure. But he's right at the beginning of the Bible. The temple was built above the old city because they felt that they had to go up to worship the Lord. That's why it's a tongue of land with the temple at the top. And you would go past David's palace to the temple. David's palace was just below the temple. The problem was water, and when the enemies would come and try and conquer the city, they could easily cut off the water because the spring was outside the city walls. But Nehemiah built a tunnel through the hill to the pool of Siloam, and that way he brought the water into the city. He had the people living opposite the wall to build that section up, so it went quite quickly, and he had to post guards. And the people laying the bricks would lay the bricks with one hand and have a dagger or a sword in the other. And they'd lay bricks by day and they'd keep watch by night. And he got the whole city rebuilt in 52 days, which was quick work. And it said it was because the people had a will to work. And for the first time, the city was secure. Realistically, they had a will to work for Nehemiah, and he had that sort of authority, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. They had a lot of external opposition to this. The first type of opposition was ridicule and mockery, and then the Samaritans came and they said that a fox could push the wall over. It's almost like the fire of London. The Lord Mayor was purported to have said a woman could pee it out, and it took hold. But in this format, the Samaritans were using ridicule and mockery, and when they saw that the mockery and ridicule didn't work, they tried threats. They even tried a conspiracy to lure Nehemiah away from the job. And they said, we want to negotiate with you. We want you to come over and sit down and negotiate with us. But Nehemiah said, no, I'm building a wall, and that's my priority. And Nehemiah also had internal difficulties. And here's the sad part. Within the walls, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, primarily through lending money. And Nehemiah was having to deal with all of this whilst building the wall. And he was having to even out economic levels. But still, there were relatively few people who lived in the city. Most were living outside of the walls in a scattered fashion, which was much easier for them to run away when their enemies came. Now Nehemiah had to go out and almost force the people to come back and live in the city. They built homes, and Nehemiah had to go out and reassure the families that the homes would be secure and not be attacked by bandits. And he had a list of people whose relatives used to live in Jerusalem. And he went around and persuaded them one by one to come back and live in the city. And he took a census. He knew where everybody was. There were 42,360 Jews, 7,337 servants, and 245 singers. Now, that's a weird type of census. Jews, servants, and singers. Why were the singers listed? Well, primarily because they wanted to restore all the services of the temple. And Nehemiah needed to know how many singers there were for working out the roster at the temple. It's then or here in Nehemiah that we see Ezra reading the Torah in public, or reading the Bible in public. It says that he not only read it, but he gives a sense of it. And reading the scriptures aloud is very necessary. It's almost meant to be read aloud, because when it was written, that was all the majority of the people had. So you get a flow of the word of God when you read the whole lot out loud, or the whole of a book. And it's important to see the sense of things, getting a structure and an idea of what God's purpose is in things. And then Ezra broke down weeping. And here we see a massive difference between Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra saw it as a time for weeping, and Nehemiah saw it as a time for partying and to enjoy yourselves. Ezra wept over the sins that God was revealing. And it may have been a matter of God was revealing sins to Ezra, but he wasn't revealing them to Nehemiah. Or it may have been that their personalities were totally different. In either case, Ezra was weeping over the sins that the people were committing. And this was around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is their harvest festival. And Nehemiah said this is a wonderful time. Rabbis these days will tell you that if you're not full of joy at the time of Tabernacles, then you are actually sinning. And Nehemiah encouraged them to have the best meal that they had ever had, and have a really good celebration. Well, Nehemiah knew that there's a time for rejoicing and a time to weep. And Ezra got them at this time to renew the covenant. He got them to promise again to submit to the God of Israel. Nehemiah also had to cause some reforms. And the difference between Ezra and Nehemiah is that Ezra pulled his own hair out, whereas Nehemiah pulled other people's hair out. And Nehemiah literally did get so annoyed with people sinning that he physically pulled their hair out. and it was the hair specifically of men who had married pagan girls who he pulled out, and he called curses down on them. So Nehemiah was a reasonably, he was a good-natured guy, but he had his breaking point. In explaining his objection to intermarriage, Nehemiah does not only see intermarriage as a violation of the divine law, he speaks about the practical consequences of intermarriage and mentions 2 points. Intermarriage challenges the ethnic identity of the community and erodes its sense of peoplehood. And Nehemiah complains, it's in Nehemiah 13:21, that the children of intermarried couples are unable to understand Hebrew, a basic requirement for being a member of the returnees of the Jewish community. And the second thing that he mentions is intermarriage challenges the religious identity of the Jewish member of a couple. Solomon was beloved of God and was led away by his Gentile wives to worship their gods. And that would have been prominent in Nehemiah's mind. And he didn't want that to happen to anybody in his community. He had to deal with, that was one of the things that he dealt with, was mixed marriages. And he also had to deal with misappropriated funds. There were people in the city who were looking after money for various people, and they misappropriated the funds that they had to look at. Another problem that Nehemiah had was desecrated Sabbaths. And he had to deal with these desecrated Sabbaths because these men who had come back from Babylon, they had the same businesses as they had in Babylon, and they weren't making the same amount of money. They didn't have nearly the same market. So to try and make up their money, they would trade on the Sabbath. And Nehemiah insisted on shutting the gates so they couldn't trade. And so they couldn't go in and out. And then he found them camping outside the gates and trading there. And he had to deal with that. So Nehemiah had a lot to deal with. And the last thing that he had to deal with was priests who neglected their duties. And above all, they were priests neglecting their duties in the temple. And he had to put that right. So Ezra and Nehemiah had to rebuild things, and they had to be rebuilders of the wall and rebuilders of the people. And they did it courageously and even on times ruthlessly. Ezra and Nehemiah tell a frustrating story in many ways. The reality of the return to Zion did not measure up to the returnees' expectations. The temple they rebuilt was smaller and far less glorious than Solomon's had been. And religious challenges such as intermarriage and resistance to Shabbat observations vexed their leaders. It really hacked them off. But the persistence and doggedness with which the Jews of the period confronted these challenges becomes a model for the generations that followed. Rabbi Tarfon said, "It was not incumbent on you to finish the work, but nor are you free to desist from it. And that's from the chapter 2 of the Mishnah. The prophets who spoke at the period of the return, whose prophecies are recorded in Isaiah 40 to 66, are in the books of Zechariah, Haggai and Malachi. They dealt with these challenges not by denying the returnees' grandiose hopes, but by prophesying delayed fulfillment. Someday Jerusalem's victory will go forth like brightness, and its salvation will burn like a torch, which is part of Isaiah 62. Someday the glory of this latter temple will be greater than its first, Haggai 2. Someday, but not immediately. Let's have a look at Nehemiah the man. On the whole, most people warm to Nehemiah rather than Ezra, probably because he was a happy man and he encouraged others to be happy. Perhaps it was all the wine that he drank in his former tasting years. He said, "The joy of the Lord is your strength," and that is a statement which still resonates today, and it's used constantly. And that statement comes from Nehemiah. I constantly want to say Hezekiah. Ezra, on the other hand, was too busy weeping for their sins. They go perfectly together. The joy and the comfort. We need them both, and we need to be in balance. Nehemiah is much more candid about his feelings than Ezra. He talks more about himself. He's more... this section of Ezra 1 and 2, is more autobiographical. And this tells us 4 things about him. The first is he was a very prayerful man. If Ezra is the Bible man, then Nehemiah is the prayerful man. And once again, they make a good relationship. But the most prominent thing about Nehemiah is before he did anything, he prayed. We have some long prayers from him and we have some short prayers from him. And it's not the length of the prayer that matters. As I've said, you can have an arrow prayer, and an arrow prayer can be just as effective as a long drawn-out prayer. It's the depth of the prayer and it's the meaning of the prayer that is most important. And we have some public prayers by Nehemiah and we have some private prayers by him. And we have prayers for things that had happened and things that were happening. This man just talked to God naturally about everything. He was a true man of prayer. He was a practical man as well. This is the second thing. And he was well organised. He could do whatever was required of him. And he could organise and delegate. 3, he was an emotional man, a man of deep feelings. There were times when he had deep sorrow, but mostly he was a happy man. He encouraged others to enjoy the Lord and rejoice. But as well as this, he could be angry. And he physically pulled out people's hair. And above all, this is the 4th thing, he was a social man. Ezra couldn't have done what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah got on with people. He was brilliant at personal management. He could get others really working and Ezra was more of a man on his own. He could come alongside you and roll up his sleeves and get on with it. And when he was around, they had a heart to work. And that was the feeling that this man imbued in people. That was the feeling that this man gave you. We'll make it work. And when he talks about the work, it's telling that he always says we and not I. I walked around the walls, but we built them. And there's such a balance in his character, prayerful and practical, joyful and sorrowful, tough and tender, sensitive to God and sensitive to people. There's a lovely balance in this man's character. And we should emulate what is good in scriptural characters and avoid their mistakes if we can. Why study history that is placed so long ago when we live 2,000 miles away and it's taken place about 2,500 years ago? Why bother with it? We are looking at interesting events and interesting people and inspiring people. But really, we're looking at God and his people. A God who bound himself by a covenant to one people and one people only. Now he binds himself to us with a new covenant, the new covenant in Christ's blood. Notice how Nehemiah talks about God as my God. And this is shows a real personal connection to God. There's a personal ownership of God. He's my God. He may be yours as well, but he's mine. And we have a picture of God who keeps his promises. We need to remember that he promised the people two things: to bless their obedience and to curse their disobedience. And when we read Leviticus 26:44, he promised to take them out of the promised land if they misbehaved. And he took them out for 70 years. Why 70 years? Well, we learn that at the book of the end, at the end of the book, at the end of the book of Chronicles. One of the rules of God's law was the land needed a Sabbath rest. And God commanded that every 7th year they should not take crops from the land, but leave it fallow rest. And this is a way that you see farmers running their fields today. Every 7 years they leave a field go fallow or rest. So that the land had a holiday. And they hadn't done this for 500 years. And if you multiply 500 by 7, it more or less comes out to 70 years. I think it comes out to 71.4 years, but more or less 70 years. And at the end of the book of Chronicles, God said, if you won't let my land rest, I will. And the land is 70 years behind its rest. So out you go from my land, so that the land rests for 70 years. God keeps his word, and whether you like the fact that God keeps his word or you don't is irrelevant. God keeps his word in the awesome things, and God keeps his word in the terrible things. And God had told the Israelites, if you don't do this, I'll kick you out of the land for the time that it needs for my land to rest. And God was as true to his word with that as he was as true to his word with the good things in life. You've got to take God at his word. And when God says to do something, woe betide you if you don't do it. He promised to reward the righteous and punish the wicked, and that's exactly what he did. And he will keep his word. And that will apply to his people as much today as back then. And it applies as much to his people as to anyone else. Paul writes to the Christians, and he says, we must all stand before judgment seat of Christ to receive the things done in the body. We must all stand before the seat of judgment. Now, in both these books, you notice God works secretly. There are no prophetic words in these books and no miracles. And yet, you can see God working in quiet ways. He works first in the leaders outside the people, men like Cyrus and Artaxerxes. God can work in the hearts of people regardless of whether they know him or not. You can pray to God for God to work in the people around you, even though they aren't Christians. And he worked by raising up Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel and Joshua and all the other people. God works by raising up people at the right time and the right leaders for the people. That's just as wonderful as miracles which God does. In God working to accomplish his purpose, we see all these things, and they're as good as miracles. But alas, those who came back to the land fell back into old habits, old sins. And the one sin that they didn't fall back into was idolatry. To this day, Jews are horrified, and they live in such horror of idolatry that they have never fallen into that trap again. But they went back to all their other sins, and that's a tragedy. Churchill wrote 6 volumes at the end of the war, and he titled the last volume, the volume, he titled the last volume, the last one he titled it Triumph and Tragedy, with and he says in about that book, the great democracies triumphed and thus were able to resume the follies that had so nearly cost them their lives. So this was his verdict. The great wartime leader had this verdict that sums up human nature. We keep doing the things that cost us. And because they went back into their old sins, God stopped speaking to them for 400 years. And God neither gave them a miracle or a message for 4 centuries. And he waited until the fullness of time, and he had sent his son. So with the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah, all concerned with rebuilding, we end up with a man called Malachi. And the very last words to Israel for 400 years was the word curse. And yet Malachi himself looked forward to the return of a prophet like Elijah, who would be sent to announce God's ultimate messenger. And how the Jewish people didn't see this, I'll never know. It's no wonder that the whole country came out to see John the Baptist. Here we have a people who had waited 400 years, and then suddenly out of the desert comes this man, looking like Elijah, dressing like Elijah, eating the same foods as Elijah, and speaking prophecies from the Lord. It's no wonder that the people went to him and were saying, this is the guy that Malachi talked about. This is the guy who's going to usher in the ultimate messenger. We often read the Bible and don't realize how long it is between books and sections of books. There are thousands of years between the beginning of the Bible and the end of the Old Testament. And we have to realize that. We have to put into context in our own head the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. And there are so many periods where there are hundreds of years between two lines, and we have to get that into our head. And Daniel predicted all of this all those years previous. He predicted the building of the new city of Jerusalem and the coming of Christ, and he predicted how long the building would take and how long it would be between the building and between the end of the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the coming of the King. This is amazing stuff, and it's incredible to think that Daniel predicted it, Malachi talked about it, and all of these things were said hundreds and hundreds of years previously, and Isaiah talked about the coming King almost a century before. It's incredible the depth to which God goes, and he puts all this forward. He shows us what's to come, and he showed the Jewish people what was to come, but they wouldn't see it. They didn't want to see it. And that's the whole point of Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel is trying to point out to the Jewish people, look, here's this guy Jesus, and he's fulfilled all these prophecies. Matthew is full of prophecies, and yet the Jewish people didn't see it. Hey-ho, they will one day. Well, that's the end of Nehemiah, and next time we'll be doing Esther, and that more or less completes a half of the Old Testament. Well, have a great day. I know this one's finished earlier than most, but have a great day, and God bless you. And I'll finish out my isolation on my own with the family. But it's been driving me bonkers not being able to go out. God bless you. Have a wonderful day and a great time until next time. God bless.